as the cold morning fog drifted across the remote Alaskan wilderness, wrapping the jagged mountains and endless snowfields in a shroud of white silence. A faint metallic glimmer beneath the ice hinted at a mystery that had haunted historians, pilots, and search teams for decades. And as the camera moves slowly across the frozen landscape, viewers feel the weight of unanswered questions, the eerie stillness of a place untouched by time, and the unsettling truth that somewhere beneath this desolate expanse lay the remains of a World War II bomber that had vanished without a trace, taking its entire crew with it. And as investigators finally chip through layers of ice and frozen earth to uncover the aircraft's nose section, perfectly preserved, the story plunges into a suspense-filled narration of the moment. The Discovery team realized the unthinkable. The bomber's windows were frosted from the inside, the cockpit still intact, and deep within, the silhouettes of the crew, oceanless, seated, frozen in the exact positions they occupied the day the aircraft disappeared, sparking shock, disbelief, and a chilling sense of stepping into a moment frozen in time. And as the narration cuts back to the past, to the final mission of the doomed bomber, the tension escalates. Describing the roar of engines as the aircraft took off from a remote wartime base, the cold wind tearing across the runway, the anxious expressions of the young crewmen preparing for another dangerous flight into unpredictable weather systems, unaware that they were flying into one of the most baffling and terrifying mysteries in aviation history. And as the bomber climbed into thick clouds swirling like restless spirits, the story immerses viewers in the suspense of radio operators losing contact, radar screens flickering with static, and the growing fear among commanders as the aircraft simply vanished, leaving behind no distress call, no debris, no sign of mechanical failure, and no explanation. And as the narrative follows the doomed bomber through its final hour, detailing the violent turbulence, razor-sharp ice crystals striking the fuselage, and the overwhelming sense of dread settling over the crew as instruments malfunctioned and visibility dropped to zero, viewers feel the suffocating claustrophobia of the freezing cockpit, the haunting rattle of loose equipment, and the trembling uncertainty of men trapped inside a steel coffin hurtling through a storm with no escape. And as lightning flashed across the wing, illuminating terrified faces, the suspense deepens, exploring the theories that would later emerge in icing, instrument failure, impossible downdrafts, or something far stranger, each one adding to the eerie aura surrounding the bomber's disappearance. And as the aircraft begins its fateful descent, the narrative shifts between the chaos inside the cockpit and the modern-day Discovery site, contrasting the violent final moments with the serene, frozen stillness in which the aircraft was found decades later, the crew preserved in a haunting tableau of silent horror. And as the story builds toward its first major crescendo, the camera zooms into the pilot's frozen face, eyes still open behind frosted goggles. A single moment of terror forever trapped in time, while investigators whisper in disbelief, realizing the bomber had not crashed violently, but instead seemed to have settled gently into the snow, as if placed there, untouched, undisturbed, sealed away by the ice for half a century. And as the chilling realization spreads, the suspense becomes overwhelming, drawing viewers deeper into the impossible mystery of how a fully intact bomber could disappear without a trace, remain hidden for decades, and somehow preserve its crew in their exact final moments, defying logic, science, and history, setting the stage for the next chapter in a story so haunting, so surreal, and so shocking that once heard, it can never be forgotten. Asterisk. As the icy wind howled across the desolate crash site like a mourning spirit, echoing the terror of that long-lost final flight, the investigators' breath crystallizing in the frigid air as they edged closer to the bomber's fuselage, each step sinking into the deep snow that had buried the aircraft for generations. The narration deepens with an almost unbearable tension, describing how the rescuers brushed away thick frost from the cockpit windows only to reveal the haunting, ghost-like outlines of the crew still strapped in, helmets intact, oxygen masks frozen in place, their uniforms untouched by decay, making the moment feel less like the discovery of a wreck and more like stumbling into a suspended reality. A moment frozen between life and death, And as the camera moves slowly past the bomber's intact wings, still marked with faded insignia, untouched by time, viewers sense the enormity of what this discovery meant. A perfectly preserved World War II aircraft, entombed in ice for decades, hiding answers to a mystery no one ever solved. And as the narration drifts back into the storm, the crew faced on their final mission, describing the deafening roar of wind slamming the fuselage, the violent buffeting that sent coffee cups, maps, and personal letters flying through the cabin. The story captures the claustrophobic fear crawling up the spines of the young airmen, their gloved hands trembling as they struggled to read flickering instruments, their breath fogging inside frozen oxygen masks. And as the bomber entered a spinning downdraft so powerful, it felt like invisible hands dragging the plane downward into oblivion. The narration emphasizes the overwhelming dread, the altitude needle dropping rapidly, alarms blaring through the shaking cockpit, the entire aircraft rattling like it was about to tear apart, yet somehow the fuselage remained intact, every rivet holding under forces that should have ripped the plane to pieces. And as the storm grew more violent, the pilot's voice crackled through the intercom, but strained, giving desperate instructions as lightning illuminated the inside of the cockpit with blinding flashes, making the terrified eyes of the crew momentarily visible in stark, ghost-like detail. And as the bomber plunged through layers of clouds so thick they appeared like dark walls closing in from every direction, the story intertwines the chaos inside the aircraft with the chilling present-day scene where investigators forced open the cockpit door for the first time in over 70 years, hinges creaking as if resisting the intrusion, and upon opening it, a blast of cold air escaped like the exhalation of a trapped spirit, revealing the frozen crew in horrifying clarity, the pilot still gripping the yoke, his hands encased in ice, the navigator slumped over charts that had fused to the table, the radio operator still wearing his headset, frozen in mid-turn, as if about to report something crucial he never had the chance to say. And as the camera lingers on these scenes, the narration deepens the emotional weight by describing the personal items scattered around the cockpit, letters meant for families, photographs of sweethearts, ration chocolate bars untouched, a pocket Bible left open on a page about courage in the face of fear. Each artifact a reminder of the human lives frozen in their final terrifying minutes. And as the modern investigators struggle to comprehend how the aircraft remained so perfectly preserved despite the catastrophic weather of the Arctic region, the narrative heightens the suspense by detailing the strange anomalies, the engines showing no sign of a flameout, the controls locked as if the pilot had deliberately performed a controlled descent. And yet there had been no distress call, no emergency transmission, nothing but eerie silence, as if the bomber had slipped out of existence, till resurfacing decades later in perfect stillness. And as the story dives into the theories surrounding this impossible scenario, was the bomber caught in a freak atmospheric phenomenon, trapped in a thermal vacuum that cushioned its descent? Did an electrical failure seal the cabin, allowing the crew to succumb to freezing temperatures before impact, leaving the aircraft to glide into the snow with terrifying precision? Or was something far stranger involved, something that defied every known rule of physics and aviation? The suspense grows thicker, gripping viewers with the same mix of fascination and dread felt by those who first uncovered the wreck. And as we return to the bomber's final moments, the cockpit illuminated by lightning, ice crawling along the windows like living veins, the engines sputtering as supercooled air choked their cylinders, the narration paints an unforgettable image of the crew fighting desperately against nature itself, their breaths freezing, their movements slowing, their vision blurring as temperatures inside the cabin plunged to lethal depths, yet still they held their positions, refusing to abandon their posts even as the bomber descended toward its icy burial. And as the aircraft finally broke through the lowest layer of clouds, the ground rushing up beneath them a vast, endless sea of snow, the pilot made one last attempt to level the wings. A final act of courage etched permanently into the frozen tableau discovered decades later. And as the story circles back to the present, the modern-day investigators stand in stunned silence, realizing they were witnessing not only a wreck, but a perfectly preserved time capsule, the final chapter of a mission that had shattered every rule of aviation understanding. And as the camera zooms out to reveal the bomber resting peacefully in its icy tomb, surrounded by mountains and swirling snow, the narration leaves viewers with the unbearable suspense of knowing that the questions surrounding this mysterious disappearance have only grown deeper, darker, and more unexplainable with every new detail uncovered, setting the stage for the next point in this haunting, spine-chilling, impossible story. The deeper investigators dug into the mystery of the missing WW2 bomber and its vanished crew. The more they realized they were no longer dealing with an ordinary crash site or a frozen relic of war, they were dealing with something that felt like time itself had been suspended. As if the aircraft had simply slipped between one moment and the next and only just reappeared decades later untouched, undisturbed, and impossibly intact. And as analysis teams gathered around the fuselage still coated in ice, still perfectly sealed, still holding the bodies of the men exactly as if they were frozen mid-breath, they kept asking the same question. How could a bomber missing for nearly 80 years look like it landed yesterday? But the more they studied, the stranger it became. Every instrument inside the cockpit was frozen mid-movement. Dials stuck at impossible angles, the altimeter showing a descent that could not have occurred based on the terrain. The oxygen gauges reading levels that contradicted the temperature and altitude at the site, the engines locked in a configuration no mechanic had ever seen. And strangest of all, one of the crewmen's hands was extended toward the emergency beacon switch. But the switch itself was completely untouched, meaning the man either died reaching for help or something stopped him milliseconds before contact. And the forensic team couldn't decide which explanation was more terrifying. And when they extracted the navigator's logbook, frozen into a solid block that had to be brought to a laboratory to thaw millimeter by millimeter, the writing inside, once visible, sent shockwaves through every historian involved, because the final entry, scribbled violently, unevenly, as if the aircraft was being shaken apart, simply read, "It's following us." That single sentence changed the entire investigation, because now they had a potential cause, not mechanical failure, not weather, not enemy fire, but the implication that something unknown, something airborne, something capable of hunting a bomber in the dead of night over the Atlantic, had been chasing them. And as the team reconstructed the bomber's last known course, they discovered radio fragments from long-forgotten archive files that no one had matched to any aircraft but now suddenly made sense. Faint, static-ridden whispers, recorded by a far-distance listening post, voices overlapping with interference. One crewman shouting about a shadow above the tail, another yelling to bank left before it hits, and then a final scream followed by total silence. The shock wasn't that these transmissions existed. The shock was that they were never connected to the bomber because the coordinates didn't match, meaning the aircraft had somehow traveled far beyond its projected flight path before crashing, moving hundreds of miles off course with no explanation. That alone was enough to label the case unprecedented. But when recovery teams examined the bomber's wings, they discovered impact marks that did not match flak. Fighters or cannon fire-long, continuous gouges carved into the metal, as if something dragged across the surface during flight with enormous force, gouges nearly identical on both wings. Symmetrical, precise, too precise to be caused by debris, weather, or stress fractures. The engineers studying them said it looked less like combat damage and more like the aircraft had been held by something large enough to grip a bomber mid-air. That conclusion terrified everyone. The brothers of two of the recovered airmen, now elderly but still alive, were contacted and shown the images. Both refused to believe the cause was natural, one saying, "My brother wrote me once about something strange they saw in the sky over Iceland. He said they were told to forget it. Maybe they couldn't." And that comment triggered a series of document requests, which unearthed an even more disturbing classified memo from 1944 describing unidentified aerial disturbances. Seen by multiple crews flying the same corridor on the same night, the bomber vanished. That memo was stamped underlined and filed under a categorical label investigators had never encountered in WW2 aviation documents. Phantom interference unsolved, and suddenly, the entire narrative changed because the bomber hadn't just disappeared. It had flown into a region filled with wartime sightings the government had quietly documented but never explained. a stretch of sky pilots once called the corridor of ghosts. But the most disturbing evidence came when the crash recovery team noticed the condition of the crew. Their faces were peaceful, almost unnervingly serene, except the radio operator, whose frozen expression suggested the last thing he saw was something so horrifying that even death hadn't erased the terror. His hand, instead of resting on his lap like the others, was clenched tight around his headset, as if he died mid-transmission, mid-warning. And when forensic audio specialists cleaned the last seconds of the aircraft's black box-adjacent magnetic recorder, they found something no one expected: a low rhythmic hum. Not mechanical, not natural, something patterned, pulsing, rising and falling in intervals too uniform to be accidental, a sound that seemed to come from outside the bomber rather than inside. That discovery prompted a second analysis, which revealed something even more shocking. The hum emitted frequencies far beyond normal engine resonance, meaning the bomber wasn't alone in the sky during its final moments. Something was pacing it. Something was approaching. Something was getting closer. But the bomber's outward trajectory made no sense, suggesting the pilots were fleeing from whatever it was at the time of the crash. And when impact simulations were run, they found the bomber had landed almost perfectly leveler, near impossibility in an uncontrolled descent, suggesting the crew was conscious seconds before impact. Why didn't they bail out? Why didn't they radio for help? Why were they all still strapped in, frozen, at their stations? The only plausible explanation was chilling. Whatever they saw in the sky terrified them more than the idea of crashing. They chose to stay together. They chose not to jump. They chose to ride the bomber down rather than face what was following them. And as investigators realized this, the question became even more horrifying. What could scare an entire trained crew into choosing certain death? And why did the bomber remain hidden for so many decades only to reappear perfectly preserved? Some theorists suggested a natural ice shift exposed it. But that explanation failed immediately when the crash site was examined, because the terrain had shown no disturbance, no new movement, no recent thaw or melt that could explain how the bomber emerged from the ice. It was simply there, as if placed, as if returned, as if whatever took it had let go. And as investigators stood around the recovered bomber, the eerie sensation that the aircraft had been put back rather than simply discovered only grew stronger, because not a single melting pattern, slope shift, or geological disturbance around the site matched the timeline of natural exposure, meaning the bomber had not gradually revealed itself, it had appeared all at once, as if something massive and unseen had lifted the ice like a curtain and set the aircraft gently onto the snow. And this theory gained even more weight when satellite imagery from just 3 months earlier was examined. The crash site area was completely smooth, untouched, a perfect sheet of ice with absolutely no visible anomaly. No metal signature, nothing that indicated an aircraft beneath. And yet now the bomber lay there pristine, unburied, unmarred, unratted, with not even the typical micro-tears in the aluminum that should occur after decades of intense pressure from glacial movement. And this impossible absence of damage led one structural engineer to whisper the chilling question no one wanted to say aloud: what if it wasn't under the ice at all? But before anyone could respond, another more disturbing mystery emerged when the medical team began cataloging the positions of the bodies. Because in addition to the radio operator's frozen terror and the co-pilot's outstretched hand, there was the pilot sitting with his hands still on the yoke, head tilted slightly to the right, eyes open, fixed on something outside the cockpit window. And when investigators matched his exact line of sight, they realized he had died staring at a specific point in the sky, the same direction. The aircraft's final course correction had been steering toward a direction where nothing should have been but empty night. And that raised yet another question. What did the pilot see in his final seconds that was so important he refused to look away, even as the bomber dropped toward the ground? The answer may have been hidden in the navigator's final scrawled notes, because under the infamous its following U.S. line was a faint, almost unreadable series of symbols that no one recognized, symbols that didn't match Allied shorthand. German codes, whether markings, or celestial navigation rubrics. Symbols that, when examined by a mathematician specializing in wartime cipher systems, appeared to represent directional movement. But not along traditional flight axes. Instead, they suggested rotation, spiraling, convergence. The kind of path something might follow if it wasn't bound by aerodynamic laws. And the mathematician, pale and visibly shaken, said, "This pattern shouldn't exist. Nothing we know can move like this." And the horror only deepened when they extracted the bomber's internal oxygen tanks, all fully pressurized. None leaking, meaning the crew did not die of hypoxia, nor frostbite, nor suffocation. They died instantly, simultaneously, as if struck by some invisible force that stopped their hearts at the same moment, even though their bodies showed no trauma. No burns, no fractures, no chemical traces. Nothing that matched any known wartime cause of death. One of the forensic pathologists, reviewing the data quietly in the corner of the tent, simply muttered, "This looks like they died of fear." And while the idea sounded impossible, the expressions on the crew's faces, especially the radio operator's scream frozen in time, made it difficult to dismiss. But the most haunting revelation came from the bomber's onboard chronometer, antique mechanical clock that unbelievably was still intact, protected within the dashboard. When researchers opened it, they discovered something that sent waves of panic through the investigation team. The clock showed that time inside the aircraft had been running significantly slower than the period it was missing. According to the mechanism, the bomber had only been airborne for roughly 80 additional minutes after its last radio contact. Yet decades had passed in the outside world. This revelation made no physical sense. A mechanical clock cannot slow down unless exposed to extreme conditions. Gravitational anomalies, magnetic interference, or something equally disruptive, none of which were present at the site. But the more troubling part wasn't the discrepancy itself, it was the direction the hands had been frozen in. They weren't pointing at the final hour or minute of recorded flight. They were pointing directly at a specific symbol scratched into the navigator's logbook. A symbol that appeared repeatedly in the final entries. A looping, circular mark that looked almost like a spiral collapsing inward. That was when the lead investigator finally lost his composure and ordered the area secured. Whispering to his assistant, "This isn't a crash site. This is a return point." Suddenly, the biggest mystery was not how the bomber crashed hit was, where it had been all these years. But the evidence only grew stranger when the metallurgical lab reported microscopic traces embedded within the bomber's outer hull, not shrapnel, not ice, not volcanic dust, but an unknown particulate substance that reflected light in a way they had never documented before. Almost like the metal had been exposed to an environment completely outside known atmospheric conditions. Something beyond jet stream altitudes, something far colder than terrestrial climate, but too uniform to be natural. One scientist even suggested the metal looked as if it had been vacuum polished, a condition seen only on objects exposed to long-term airlessness like satellites. But the bomber was from the 1940s, decades before orbit-capable flight. So how did its skin acquire characteristics seen only in deep space metals? The immediate reaction was disbelief, followed by fear, followed by a silent, sickening realization that perhaps the bomber had not been drifting inside the Earth's environment at all. Meanwhile, perfusion tests conducted on the crew's tissues revealed something even more disturbing: no biological degradation. No typical long-term freeze damage, no cellular collapse, meaning the bodies had not decomposed at a normal rate. They looked like men who had been frozen only a few weeks, maybe months, not 17-9 years. And that discovery forced the investigation team to confront the most terrifying possibility of all. The bomber and its crew did not merely disappear. They were taken somewhere time did not move normally. And whatever brought them back intact. And as we enter the final chapter of this unbelievable mystery, imagine this: a military recovery team in frost-white suits, standing silently around the discovered bomber, staring at the cockpit where the crew remained perfectly preserved, and one of the officers, an older man who had participated in Cold War black site, retrievals, slowly removed his glove, placed his fingertips on the metal, and whispered, "This aircraft is not 70 years old. The clock on this thing hasn't even aged a day," and his voice trembled not because of the cold, but because he knew what that meant. And while the others didn't yet understand, he continued, "If metal doesn't age, then time didn't pass. At least not for them," and before anyone could react, the wind roared across the ice, the sky darkened, and a low-frequency rumble rolled across the valley deep. Mechanical and impossibly rhythmic, the kind of sound no natural storm produces. And the men looked up as the clouds above them formed a perfect circle, rotating with unnatural precision, and suddenly the atmosphere itself felt electrically charged. The same kind of static that precedes earthquakes or nuclear tests. And one soldier shouted, "Get back inside the tents!" But no one moved because every pair of eyes was locked on the eerie formation overhead, and a young technician, barely out of training, muttered, "It's the same pattern, the same spiral from the navigator's notebook." And instantly, every senior officer froze in horror because he was right. The clouds were rotating in the exact same impossible trajectory recorded by the dying navigator. And then the chronometer inside the bomber, the one scientists had painstakingly removed and placed on an insulated crate, began to tick, even though its gears had been frozen solid for decades. And worse, it began ticking backwards, rapidly, violently, spinning the hands in reverse like time itself was being pulled in the opposite direction. And one of the doctors screamed, "Don't touch it!" But the warning came too late, because the technician reached out, grabbed the clock, and collapsed instantly. Not dead something, worse, his eyes darting rapidly under the lids as if he were experiencing thousands of images in seconds. His pulse skyrocketing to dangerous levels, pupils shrinking to pinpoints, his body convulsing in a way none of them had ever seen. And when they lifted him, he gasped to words that chilled every soul present, "They're coming," and before anyone could question him, the bomber's engines, dead for decades, empty of fuel, coughed, sparked, and roared to life with a deafening metallic scream, spinning at full power despite having no functional igniters, and the propellers, frozen since the 1940s, now whirled so fast they blurred into a single shimmering ring, creating small whirlwinds of snow around the aircraft, drawing in loose equipment, scattering papers, forcing the entire team to stumble back as if the plane itself had awakened, alive, aware, and enraged. And one of the structural engineers cried, "This isn't possible! The pistons are disintegrated, there's nothing inside to fire." But it didn't matter because the bomber was no longer operating under physical laws. And the manifolds glowed with a cold blue light, not heat, but something else, something that made the lead investigator shout, "Shut down your electronics! Now, now!" Because the laptop screens around the site began flickering uncontrollably, displaying distorted images of the bomber. Then the crew, then the sky, then an unknown symbol, the looping spiral again and again, as if the aircraft was projecting something into their devices. And suddenly, every radio crackled with a sound no one could identify, not Morse, not static, not interference, but breathing. A slow and deliberate inhale and exhale, perfectly synchronized across every device. And then, layered beneath it, faint but unmistakable, was the voice of the pilot dead for 17 years saying, "Hold steady. They're beside us," and the recovery team panicked. Some fleeing into the ice fields, others diving behind equipment. But nothing could break the rising terror because the bomber's cockpit windows, clouded by decades of frost, began to clear, not melting but evaporating, revealing something impossible. The crew were no longer frozen in their original positions. Their heads had turned toward the investigation team. Eyes now fully open, pupils dilated, faces slack and expressionless like mannequins. Watching them, following their movements in perfect unison, as if the dead were observing the living, and a scream tore through the camp when someone realized the radio operator's mouth had changed position. His scream was no longer the one they found. It was wider, impossibly wide, as if he had tried to shout a warning that had never been heard. And as the aircraft's engines revved even harder, creating a deep harmonic resonance that vibrated through the ice beneath their feet, The chronometer in the technician's hands shattered, releasing a pulse of air so cold it knocked him backward. And the lead investigator yelled, "Everyone away from the plane." But it was too late because the bomber began lifting slowly, steadily, its landing gear detaching from the snow without any thrust vector that made physical sense. Rising like a puppet pulled by an invisible string, and the spiral cloud overhead tightened into a perfect vortex, as if forming a tunnel. And the entire sky seemed to bend inward, light stretching, shadows bending, snowflakes suspending in midair, and one of the officers, his voice breaking, whispered, "My God, it's going back." And he was right. The bomber was rotating to match the exact angle of ascent logged in the navigator's final entry. The impossible spiral path, preparing to leave the ice the same way it had reappeared. And then the last surviving radio at the camp crackled again, this time with the co-pilot's voice saying, in a tone so calm it was horrifying, "Do not follow," and with a scream of metal that echoed across the valley like the sky itself was tearing open, leaving behind a shockwave that knocked every man to the ground, not destructive but unnaturally cold, the kind of cold that feels intelligent, intentional, like a warning. And then the vortex vanished. The sky returned to normal, the wind stopped, and the world went silent, leaving the cratered snowfield empty. No bomber, no crew, no trace of the aircraft at all, as if it had been reclaimed by whatever force had taken it in 1943. And the investigation ended the same way. It began with a mystery too large, too terrifying, too incomprehensible for human logic. A secret sealed and classified vaults with one chilling description written in red ink across the final page of the report. Aircraft did not crash. Aircraft was retrieved.